Good day, friends. Welcome to, what shall we call it? OBEJournal 2019. I mean, it is 2019, February the 2nd, so that seems as appropriate as anything. I'd like to take up a point that was gone over several times in the 2018 journal, but I was encouraging people to do an instant transfer and overcome the notion that you have to use aids of any kind or rituals that with a couple of minutes relaxation you can project. Not even that. Now, in doing that, I was referencing my own experience and other sources. And while I recognize that lots of people would not wish to feel that such was possible, I wanted to lay the ground for future experiments. And in doing so, at this point, I want to remind you that it took me ages to get to that spot. And the first seed for me was the first chapter of Bruce Moen's first book, Voyages into the Unknown. First of 5 books on his projection experiences, beginning at the Monroe Institute and then continuing on his own. And I had already written almost all of my first book, Eternal Life and How to Enjoy It, before discovering Bruce. I think I discovered his online presence first for a few months, was looking at afterlifeknowledge.com and I think contributing to the conversation board. It's many years ago now. And wondering if it could be useful to me. My own first book was a lot of remembered lucid dreams, an awful lot, assisted by channeling it. Whereas if you've read the second one, More Adventures in Eternity, it's more specifically about using hemisync and sort of giving the nod to guides, saying, show me where I can do a retrieval, take me here, take me there, take me where I'm needed. And of course, in that book, you find out that eventually the guides just say, okay, enough already, do it on your own, and with a lot of humor. So a little bit of my journey there. And again, that's almost 15 years ago now. But so this getting to the point of feeling that one can do instantaneous transfer, or almost instantaneous, is recognizing that we, amongst other things, exist on many levels, not just this one. But I want to go back to the roots of how I discovered this. Now, in Bruce's first book, which is mostly about his early days of traveling to the Monroe Institute for various programs and learning to use the hemisync, going through it fairly slowly, baby steps, discovering this, discovering that, fighting his own doubts, and throwing them out the window. He gives an introduction where it's he takes you to a good bit along on his journey. And this is where I first got the notion that instantaneous transfer was possible. So this chapter is called Oklahoma City, April 19, 1995. For several years, I'd been sailing back and forth between this world and the afterlife. Ashore on many uncharted islands, I'd searched for hidden treasures, as I call the knowledge my exploring brings. On some, my discoveries showed that there was a lot to learn. The terrorist bombing in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995, proved to be just such an island. I was working as a contract engineer in Colorado. Word of the bombing started floating through the office in the late morning. Early reports said that many people had been killed, but none of us knew the extent of the carnage. Learning to assist people who have just recently died was how I first learned to explore the afterlife. So I had brief thoughts that there might be some way I could help those who had been killed. I decided to try to do something when I got home from work. As I drove the freeway home that night, NPR filled in with more details of the bombing. It was pretty clear by the time I switched on the television in my apartment that many, many people had died. As darkness approached, I began to feel a restless, raspy, fidgety energy that seemed to fill the air around me. A strong desire to be with other people pulled me out to a nearby Bennigan's restaurant for dinner. At least there, the loud music and noisy, crowded atmosphere matched the energy I felt surrounding me when I was alone at home. Sitting at a small table by myself, I'd just finished placing my order for a seafood platter when I remembered earlier thoughts about trying to assist victims of the bombing. Still thinking it was something I'd actually do later, I stood on a stool in Bennigan's, quietly expressing my willingness to provide assistance. That's how it always starts. I just expressed the intent to proceed. I thought I'd have plenty of time to finish my meal, go home, lie down, and then begin to carry out my intent to assist. I have done such things before, and it has always worked out just fine. But hidden treasure is a tricky thing. You're never sure what you're going to find. Moments after expressing my willingness to assist, I felt the voice of Coach, a non-physical friend you'll come to know later. As I say, this is leaping forward from his early days. And Coach was well established as a spirit guide, later on. Amidst the overly loud music and many people's voices, I focused on Coach's voice. "Okay, Bruce," I felt him saying, "they can use the help." In the next instant, sitting on a tall stool in Bennigan's and remaining aware of those surroundings, suddenly I was also rushing through blackness towards 3 infants who had died in the blast. As I approached, I could see them sitting close together, seemingly unharmed and perhaps a little dazed. I'd never retrieved more than one person at a time before, but this didn't seem much different. Besides, these were babies, and I could easily hold 3 of them together in my arms. I scooped up the babies into my arms and spun around, feeling for the direction of the reception center. The reception center is a port of entry for the newly deceased in the afterlife. Whatever needs they have will be provided for in this calm setting with familiar Earth-like appearance. For some who arrive here, those needs include soothing the trauma of dying. The helpers at the reception center are good at that. They get lots of practice. The reception center in Focus 27 area of the afterlife looks very much like the physical world. The park there has grass, trees, sidewalks, benches, and flower gardens. As on every previous trip I have made there, I knew people would be waiting when I arrived. They would take these babies in and then begin the process of helping them adjust to their new lives in their new world. As the reception center came into view, I could see the people standing on the grass in the park, waiting. Out of my habit of always trying to get verifying information, I tried to get identities of some of those people waiting on the ground. I felt aunts, uncles, and non-related volunteer helpers take the babies from my arms. I paused a moment, again out of habit, to imprint in memory the impressions I'd received about those who had been waiting. Then I turned around, focused on the location of the blast site, and accelerated into the blackness again. In the few seconds before my arrival, I checked and noted I was feeling little emotion as a result of what I had just done. There were some feelings of sadness for the baby's early loss of life, but not much more. Several more quick-paced trips followed as I went back and forth between the blast site and reception center. The first few trips were with children, ages maybe 2 to 8. Out of habit, I continued to gather and store in memory impressions that might be useful later to verify what I thought I was doing. Early in my training, gathering verifiable information was important to me. I needed proof I wasn't making it all up. I'd gotten that proof so many times by now that there was no real need to continue gathering data, but some old habits just become so ingrained you continue to do them without thinking. And of course I went through that phase myself, as detailed in More Adventures in Eternity. Next, a woman named Charlotte materialized in the blackness in front of me. She seemed dazed and in shock. She became aware of my presence and almost immediately looked at me through a shell-shocked face and glazed over eyes. I'd explained that I'd been sent to bring her back home. I sensed that somewhere inside her it registered from her religious upbringing that when she died, someone was supposed to come for her. In her dazed state of shock, she was willing to go wherever I would take her. I reached out and took her by the hand. Then we lifted off and flew away in the direction of the park. When we arrived, again out of habit, I tried to get an impression of the name of the person who met her there. Then I turned back toward the blast site. There were several more adults in rapid succession. A man named Ralph or Rob or something like that was the last one I had felt I had time to identify. I was beginning to feel a bit overwhelmed by the sheer number of people I was encountering. I usually do this sort of thing with one person at a time, and there might be several days or weeks between such trips. Again, I gave several examples of the days and weeks between such trips with people who were resistant to moving on in More Adventures in Eternity. And they can be tough. Yeah, you really got to push them. Or convince them, or something. At times I would come back more fully to awareness of my loud, noisy surroundings sitting on the stool at Bennigan's. Awareness of my activities at Oklahoma City would fade a little, and I'd just be eating dinner or sipping my beer. Then the sights and sounds would begin to fade, and I'd be moving through the blackness again. So that's a good reminder there that you can't actually do this sort of thing in a public place. Once you're practiced, confident, and able to cast your doubts aside, and that you're fantasizing or making it all up. It took me quite a while to get to that spot. And obviously when I'm in the OBEJournal 2018 doing the what I then called the instant transfers, or almost instant transfers, I am coming from a place of experience and confidence, which I don't expect everyone to do just because I tell them to do it, but it's to give you something to aspire towards, a realization that it can be done, that it's not impossible, that it's not reserved for just a few. There's, in the New Age movement, there's too many legends around about people achieving enlightenment after years in Zen temples or Buddhist monasteries or, contemplative Christian retreats. Well, I'm not saying they're not true, but they're more an example of how we assume that years of effort and trial and tribulation and struggle and tears and joys must come before a relative state of enlightenment. Well, in my experience, that's not true. It can be true, but it doesn't have to be true. And doing instantaneous transfers and talking to people in spirit, it doesn't mean you're enlightened, but it does mean you're taking a couple of big steps along the way to realize that we are multidimensional beings. And that's, an important realization that supersedes the linear notion of we're alive now and we don't die, but we're alive in spirit, which is a first big step. But it takes you to we're alive in spirit now, not after we die. Well as after we die. A year and a half before Oklahoma City, I'd met a special group of helpers, people who have lived in the afterlife long enough to understand how to assist with the special needs of the new arrivals, while they were assisting after an earthquake in India in which some 68,000 people had died. I think I've got some notes in one of my books of essays. Gosh, which one? Can't remember now. I'm sorry, you'd have to check. But notes on earthquake retrievals, um, which obviously I had done long after reading about this. I was then a participant in a research group at the Monroe Institute exploring how to assist the deceased in a large-scale natural disaster. The earthquake, which had just happened a few days before, a regularly scheduled exploration session, presented an opportunity to gather such information. I learned much about the inner workings of assisting with large groups of newly deceased people. As I stood now at the Oklahoma City blast site, peering into the blackness, trying to find another victim, I felt one of those helpers approach me from behind and recognized his voice, despite having never seen him. There's a lot of that with helpers too. Yeah, there's voices and there's advice, and you don't see them because I don't know, they're busy and they can't be bothered manifesting, or you're doubtful and can't raise your vibration to the level where you can see them. It doesn't really matter. He suggested that I stop making trips back and forth to the reception center by myself. Bruce, just get their attention. Get them to walk towards you, I felt him say. As they move closer to you, helpers will step out from behind you to greet them. Let the helpers transport them to the reception center. No sense using up your valuable time in making all those trips back and forth. You're better at getting their attention than we are anyway. Remember how you used the ability to assist us in India? Just bring them in close and let us take care of the rest. Okay, I said. 2 more helpers from the previous experience appeared, looking like very, very bright lights, so bright as to be almost blinding to the eye. They took up positions on either side of me, and together they illuminated the blackness like 2 huge searchlights, making it easier to find victims of the blast. We began moving forward together, penetrating more deeply into the site. I quickly lost track of the numbers or names or anything else about the people we'd found. I was so overwhelmed by their numbers that I gave up my old habit of gathering information. They came into view, I got their attention and moved towards us. As each approached, I could feel a helper standing close behind, stepping out into view. Taking the person by the hand, talking softly, moving gently, the helper would turn toward the direction of the reception center. Then they would move off together slowly, disappearing into the blackness. Again, I experienced that myself later with in Chechnya, what's become known as the Beslan school bombing. And a lot of us, because of the internet and various things, a lot of us were actually there ready for that Beslan school bombing. And the day I found myself doing it was a day in which, as a bus driver, I'd taken people to a resort place by the lake, a couple of miles north of here, dropped them off, and had driven to another little town, stopped, and had lunch, and went for a walk up into the hills, because it was hours before I had to get these people back. And lay down in a very beautiful pioneer graveyard on a sunny day, and meditated, and moved into the Beslan school bombing. And how did I even know about it? I mean, physically, how did I know about it? Would I maybe have read the paper, or it happened the day before, or I'm not sure. And found myself going backwards in time and doing it. And again, you get to that thing, well, am I going backwards a day from here lying in the sunshine, or am I just retrieving the memory of what I did? I got the feeling I was already there. I had projected, because it had been in the news for days, and we were expecting it to happen, hoping it wouldn't, but expecting. And I was part of a very organized rescue team, handing bodies, almost like firefighters or something, but on the non-physical level. And then later, by synchronicity, at least a couple of years later, I encountered someone who was visiting Toronto area where I live, and who I think had read one of my books and reviewed it or something, and was in Toronto for some other reason, and asked if we could meet, and we hung out at a hotel, talked for an hour, and I mentioned the Beslan school bombing, and she looked at me like, I was there too. And I think, when my account of it in the book, I think, hadn't appeared at that point, or if it had, she hadn't read it, and she had read the first book. So all these kind of things you'll find that will happen. Interesting synchronicities like that. As I continued scanning for more people, Rebecca, one of the most loving people I know in this or any other world, and my most loved and revered friend in the physical world, came into view. Rebecca had also participated in the Indian earthquake exercise. Now in Oklahoma City, she was doing the same thing. Standing, smiling, her arms spread out in love, she was providing a portal that was draining off the emotional blackness of fear. By extending her love into the blast, she was relieving the pressure, casting light into the darkness. We acknowledged each other with smiles, and then I moved on with the two bright light helpers still at my side. As we continued searching, I became aware of something very strong, just the hint of a feeling at first. I realized I had been there all along. I realized it had been there all along, but I had been able to ignore it until then. It must be something like what a firefighter experiences going into a burning building to rescue a buddy. At first, he is too busy trying to locate and rescue his friend, so he is barely aware of the surrounding maelstrom. If he stops to think about his surroundings, all of a sudden, he can see the flames and feel the heat. Firefighters probably know better than to stop and do such a thing. I'm not a firefighter. I didn't know. I stopped for a moment, naively opening up my awareness to the now strong feeling I'd been only dimly aware of in the background. I realized immediately that it was emotional energy of incredible power. Then all of a sudden, man, could I feel the heat. The burning, searing power and intensity of these emotional energies was incredible. Grief and confusion were so strong that when they first hit me, I felt my awareness begin to quiver, wavering toward unconsciousness. Unbelievably horrendous levels of grief, fear, anger, frustration, and rage surged through me. This part of the hidden treasure I was not prepared for in the least. Instants passed like years as I struggled to push the door of my awareness closed against the tremendous pressure of these emotions. Finally, after I was able to move my attention away from the emotional energies of the blast site, I could stop and catch my breath. Now, some of you may recall my first book, Eternal Life and How to Enjoy It, when I was learning from my guide Henry how to participate in these things. It was a mudslide in Central or South America, and I started out quite well, but became overwhelmed and had to be, sent home. And, go home and relax, and we'll do this another time. So that was the overwhelming, you need to be able to shut that off. You need to be efficient, not particularly sympathetic. You need to be, sympathy drives you generally, sympathy and compassion, but the actual activity requires efficiency and distancing. It took me several moments to regain my composure. As I hovered in the blackness, resting for a while, I thought about what had just happened and realized that those powerful energies to which I had opened up were not coming from the people I was assisting, but from physically alive people at the site and throughout the country. The bombing had focused the emotional energies of millions into the blast site. Rescue workers, victims, family members, and people around the world were all feeling frustration, anger, grief, and the more they worked, waited, and watched. Those emotions were being projected into the blast site area because people's attention was focused there while they were feeling them. Well, there's a good deal more of similar things that happened, and sharing with Rebecca afterwards, and diffusing the accumulated traumatic or energies of trauma that had surrounded them after the experience. And he talks about the learning that he had of himself. Like, my exposure in Oklahoma City had stirred up every bit of my own unresolved emotional baggage. That was all that was left to deal with after I'd sent the energies I'd picked up back to their rightful owners. To release what they had stirred up in me, I had to welcome in my feelings and give them expression. As I cried and raged and talked and fretted, the strength of the waves gradually subsided. So a bit of roots there. And he says later maybe it wasn't the wisest choice to do it in the noisy restaurant, but I think he was teaching himself a lesson of bilocation, that it can be achieved almost anywhere. In fact, it can be achieved anywhere. And I had a number of experiences myself, after that. Not immediately, some years later. And you probably have yourselves. And if you haven't, you probably will fairly soon. So this notion of instant transfer through, a meditative experience and imaginative exercise, if you will, that I did in many videos prior to this, 2018 and 2017, is, again, something I'd like you all to think of carefully and seriously. It's not unattainable. And the doubts and difficulties and challenges that you will have to overcome are the same as any other more ritualized efforts. To do something effortlessly and to do it with great effort are merely two stages on the same journey. And as much as you might feel, well, I'm not ready for that, but I will be one day. While it's true that timeline that you're putting on it here and what I can do in the future, you can take it and bring them much closer together. It's much more about casting aside your doubts and your self-criticism than accumulating experience and intelligence. You already have the experience and intelligence. All of you are going out of your body when you're asleep and doing all kinds of things at night. You're always doing much more than you realize, and little dribs and drabs come through in flashing memories during the day, or chunks of lucid dreams that will come to you early in the morning. Maybe you write those down in a journal. But you can push the envelope much farther. And who you want to be up here in my you can bring those two things much closer together than you think they are now. And have way more fun than you think you can. And let's think positively about this as we plow through this Northern Hemisphere winter. And those of you down south, my Australian friends, you're plowing through something completely different, I understand. It's rather warm down there. And I'm amazed that you can even tolerate it, to be quite honest. It's when I read of the temperatures in places like Melbourne, I just go, oh, can't believe that. But there we go. We choose our poisons and off we go on our earthly journeys. So to all of you, a very challenging and rewarding 2019. And we shall continue sooner than you think.